recent months, we've seen North Korea carry out a new missile test, a new nuclear test, and here in South Korea, a new government has taken power. But there's nothing new about the veritable minefield that is North-South relations. Our guest this evening has a possible solution, although the leaders of the U.S. and South Korea may not be willing to listen. Donald Gregg is a former U.S. ambassador to South Korea, and he joins us now. Thank you very much for being here.
Delighted to be here.
Now let's begin with that possible solution that I alluded to there. You've been advocating in recent weeks dialogue with North Korea while the international community seems to be pushing the other direction for tougher sanctions. Why is dialogue at this point, in your mind, a better option?
Well, I think that we've had the Cold War persist on the Korean Peninsula for 60 years. And the basic problem is that we have had sporadic dialogue, but never really prolonged dialogue with the sort of patience that was necessary to take the U.S.-South Korean relationship from a very difficult era. And because we have constantly stayed in touch with the South Koreans and through confrontations, disappointments, and so forth, we now have a tremendous relationship with South Korea being recognized by President Obama as our most reliable ally in Northeast Asia. And we've never done that with North Korea. It's been a sort of a steady by jerks procedure where something they did we saw as breaking up the pattern, or something we did which they saw as being totally out of touch in terms of any desire to establish sustained dialogue.
So sustained dialogue begins with a first step. Hypothetically, let's say they put you in charge of starting up dialogue with North Korea. What is the first step? What does it look like, and where does it lead?
The North Koreans are very hierarchical, and they don't take seriously people who are not of really significant rank. I've been to North Korea 5 times. I've met with them many times. We get on well, but they say you could keep coming forever. You can never solve our problems because you're not high-ranking enough. So I would suggest that John Kerry, when he gets set up to do business, that perhaps he sends somebody representing him who would pick up on a dialogue started with the North Koreans last March in a meeting in New York, which was disrupted by their firing of the missile which broke up the Leap Day agreement, and say, look, we were talking about a possible visit to the North, what would be necessary to put that process in motion.
You bring up the Leap Day agreement, and I think that's a perfect example of something that critics would point to in this push sort of for dialogue. They would say, look, we've entered into dialogue before, we've made agreements, and then 1 month later, weeks later, North Korea does something like a missile test and completely basically tears up that agreement. What do you do when that happens? I mean, how do you sort of negotiate with a North Korean regime that does that sort of thing?
Wasn't the firing of that satellite on the 100th anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birth?
Sure.
Shouldn't we have expected them to do something to commemorate that?
Right.
Hadn't we been told that they intended to do it?
Right, that's all in there, but the point is when you enter these agreements and they make another provocation, I mean, where does the U.S. stand? I mean, what can they do realistically when things like that happen?
But why do you call celebrating the 100th anniversary of your founding father a provocation? We said, don't do it. And they said, we're going to do it. Mm-hmm. And they did it.
So there was, what, a miscommunication or a misunderstanding?
I think the Americans are a little embarrassed about it. I don't think anything was really written down. And we sort of waggled our finger at them. And I think if we'd been vicarious, something that's very hard to do when you're demonizing the person you're talking with, we'd have said, okay, they've got to do something to celebrate this 100th anniversary. Here's a young guy in the North trying desperately to solidify his role as leader. And so it's quite natural that there've been some embarrassing failures in space, and they're going to try again until they can complete it. And we did none of that, and so we broke off everything after that missile was fired.
And now things, as we have seen, are back to square one, or even, I guess, beyond or behind square one. You've mentioned in the past, too, that Kim Jong-un, you believe, is someone that the West would be able to talk to. Why do you say that?
Well, I think the body language he is given. I watched him greet Lee Hee-ho, the Kim Dae-jung's widow. Very, very polite. I've listened to things that he has said. I've looked at the places he has gone. I've looked at the generals he has fired. I've heard him say, I don't want to do war. I've heard him say, we want to pivot toward economic development. And I think those things need to be taken seriously. We don't know much about him. We missed a chance to get to know him. When he first appeared in 2009, I suggested to Vice President Biden that we invite him to the United States for an orientation tour. That was turned down because they said, well, the Republicans would have just laughed us out of town if we'd done that. And maybe the invitation wouldn't have been accepted. But the fact that we'd made the invitation would have been taken very seriously by them.
You mentioned the politicians in the U.S. There's a lot of pushback from the U.S., from political circles. This idea of negotiating and talking and entering into dialogue with North Korea is something that you said was something that might have been laughed at, and I think that's probably an accurate assumption there. Why is that? Why is that barrier there?
Well, I think because the predictions, there's sort of a Greek chorus of American officials in and around Washington who have been predicting collapse in the North. And I think it's very difficult for them to suddenly come up with pronouncements that have North Korea going on to something else. And so I'm hoping that Secretary Kerry, as he gets organized, can bring some fresh faces into his regime and move forward without being burdened by all the failures of this group who've been predicting chaos and failure inaccurately for the last 10 or 15 years.
Do you think there's any chance whatsoever that that's going to happen, though? Are you hopeful?
Yes, I am hopeful, because I have a lot of respect for Secretary Kerry. I was with him last March when he met with a group of North Koreans in Washington. There was talk of a possible visit to North Korea. And I think when he gets booted and spurred, and he starts to talk with President Park Geun-hye, and when he reaches out to the Chinese, I think he may find some support for reaching out to the North Koreans in a different way than we have in the past.
So you mentioned the first step of this plan would be to send a high-level official, perhaps to Pyongyang, or invite a high-level official to the White House, or something along those lines?
No, I wouldn't have anybody go to the White House. I think a high-level envoy to
Pyongyang.
To Pyongyang. Now, the naysayers will say, well, we sent Joe Detrani twice to North Korea and he didn't get anything. But he went saying, well, okay, promise to give up your nuclear weapons and then we'll talk to you. And Kim Jong-un isn't going to do that. He has decided that the best thing for him to do is to pursue the development of a nuclear weapons capacity. And I think that there's nothing really going to stop him until he becomes convinced that he has a better option for the future of his country through a relationship with us leading to a peace treaty. And I think that's the way to go. We don't want to fight the North Koreans. A lot of people say, what are you making excuses for these people? Think of the gulags. I mean, why do you touch these people with a 10-foot pole? And I said, look, I've been dealing with difficult regimes for the last 60 years. And the way they change peacefully is when they realize it's in their interest to change. And North Korea is so isolated, it really is, I think, sort of unaware of the equities involved in being a normal member of the family of nations. And so I think as they get more information, as they become more aware of their surroundings, I think they will realize that they are going to have to change. And I just heard that there's been a big downturn in the number of people held in the gulags. And I was very interested to hear about that, as I have long felt that Kim Jong-un, as somebody who was educated in part in Switzerland, had a very different appreciation of the outside world than either his father or his grandfather.
You also made a very interesting comparison in the Hangul newspaper here in Korea, comparing Kim Jong-un to Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet Union leader. Tell us a little bit about that comparison.
Well, I was National Security Advisor to Vice President Bush, and I have a lot of respect for the Finns. And so Bush went to Finland, set up a very good relationship with President Mauno Koivisto. The Finns had a little more elbow room in Northern Europe than the others. They were very interested in what we were doing with the Soviets on arms control. We were very interested on their take on Gorbachev because they were the first ones to alert us to him. He had a conflict with a guy named Romanov, And they said, watch Gorbachev, he represents entirely new things. And so they sort of help us trace his rise, so that when Bush met him at the death of Chernenko, he wrote the message to Gorbachev, back to Reagan, saying this is a man we can work with to end the Cold War. Now, we don't know all of that about Kim Jong-un, and that's why I wanted to invite him to the United States, because he's going to be around for 3 or 4 decades.
To get to know him.
To get to know him. Because I think the potential is there for a very different kind of relationship. And I know the neocons will say, who's more ridiculous, Dennis Rodman or Kim Jong-un? But I take that visit as a very, very interesting development. As we knew he was a basketball nut, and apparently his brother was a big Dennis Rodman fan.
Right.
And Rodman used to play with the Bulls. And
Kim Jong is a big Bulls fan.
And a
right.
Michael Jordan fan.
Sure.
And I just was shown something that indicates that there's some possible follow-on, maybe leading to another sports-related visit. And Rodman's statement to ABC is, Kim Jong-un's message to Obama is, please call me. I don't want to do war. And I remember ping pong diplomacy with the Chinese. I remember hockey games and so forth with the Russians. And so I think you have to take this fairly seriously.
I do wonder, though, you sound very hopeful and optimistic that this could work, but all signs right now point to it going the other direction. As I mentioned, the sanctions push is in full force right now. If things keep going down the path they're going right now, where do you see it leading?
Well, I think we're at a very sensitive period right now, because we are conducting military exercises, and so are the North Koreans. And the North Koreans are made very nervous by the exercises that we conduct. When I was ambassador, I was able to stop Team Spirit, which was the equivalent exercise that is going on now, and that opened up a period of real dialogue between North and South Korea, which went on until Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense, suddenly decided Team Spirit ought to be put back in place. That ended everything. North Korea pulled out of the NPT, and the nuclear crisis of 1994 came into being. So this is a sensitive period. We need to get through this training period. But in terms of sanctions, there are a number of very sensible people speaking up against them. Fareed Zakaria had a very interesting program the other day, citing the fact that sanctions haven't worked in Cuba, the fact that prolonged dialogue with Burma and Vietnam led it in a different direction, and then citing a 10-year connection between Syracuse University and Kim Il-sung University that I've been involved in. We've trained North Koreans in IT in Beijing, and he cited that as a kind of example to sort of open up North Korea in terms of the information flow, and that he feels would be a lubricant for change. So then there are other people. Steve Bosworth is now saying we need to talk to them. Bob Gallucci, who was the architect of the Agreed Framework, is the same thing. And Bill Perry, who was the author of the best prolonged period of dialogue with North Korea, which led to the solving of the missile crisis in 1999 and 2000, he has also said the same thing. So there isn't as much unanimity in the chorus of cries for more sanctions. There are some very sensible people saying that strategic patience hasn't worked. We're now into the 61st year of the Cold War. We need to do something different, and they all agree that sustained dialogue is the way to go. And I would agree with that, and I would refer to the kind of sustained dialogue we have had with South Korea, which in the end has resulted in the kind of relationship we have between Seoul and Washington.
Tell us a little bit about this parallel that we were speaking earlier, about this parallel between South Korea and North Korea. You sort of draw a parallel between histories.
Well, I arrived here as Seoul station chief for CIA 40 years ago. And Park Chung-hee was president. He had sent over 300,000 troops to help us in Vietnam, and he saw us getting booted out of Vietnam, and he began to lose faith in us as an ally.
Moving forward a little bit, I suppose.
Moving forward.
You're talking about, of course, President Park Chung-hee. His daughter is now the president of South Korea here. You have faith in her. You're very supportive of what you think she can do here with this North Korea crisis.
Well, the thing that just galvanizes me on her is the fact that she was willing to visit North Korea in either late 2001 or 2002 and talk with Kim Jong-il, and they came up with a list of 5 or 6 things that they would work toward, such as reuniting family, locating missing bodies of soldiers, working on clearer definition of the NLL. And she came back, and I saw her at the opening game of the World Cup in 2002, and she knew who I was. I'd met her when she was a young woman. And I went up to her and I said, I want to congratulate you for being willing to go to North Korea. And she said, we must look to the future with hope, not to the past with bitterness. Now that is a magnificent statement, and I think I hope that she carries that thought with her. I then invited her to come to the United States. I heard her speak twice, once at the Korea Society, which I then was head of, and then at Columbia University, and my feeling about her is that she has inherited her father's head and her mother's heart. So I think she's a very talented woman. It's just amazing. This friend of mine who was in Pyongyang and then went to Beijing, the Chinese are all agog about the fact that the Koreans were the first in Asia to elect a woman.
President.
So I think it's going to take her some time to sort of give herself some elbow room among the sort of chauvinistic elements that are crowding in around her. But I have great faith that she's going to be an extremely effective president of South Korea.
She may not have time or elbow room, though, as it pertains to North Korea. Many people are saying that some sort of provocation will be coming in the next few months, some sort of new provocation to sort of test her. The South Korean people, quite frankly, would like to see some sort of reaction instead of what we've seen in the past. President Park has talked about dialogue. She's talked about that during the campaign. Her inauguration address, she talked about it as well. Is she actually going to be able to follow through with that, though, in the face of continued provocations and threats?
Well, I like the term trust politique, and I heard today from someone who knows that this is a continuation of Ostpolitik by Willy Brandt, which was adopted by No Tae-you as Nordpolitik, and now here is Trustpolitik. So I think she sees some continuity in these 3 things. I don't think it's a necessity that we're going to see more provocations from North Korea. I think it depends on the small signals that we send now. First, we need to get through this tense period of training, and then I think the first move she makes, or the first things that Kerry says, I think will be very, very important. So sort of the signaling that goes on in the next 2 or 3 months, I think is extraordinarily important. And I don't expect him to do something else, such as you mentioned, unless there are things said to him by us which he would take as a provocation. And I think it's going to be very interesting that if we do push for more sanctions, that's going on in the UN Security Council, I think it's going to be interesting whether the Chinese and the Russians go along. The most positive reaction any country has sent North Korea is Russia, which canceled a $6 out of $7 billion debt that North Korea owed Russia. That's a very astute move, because the Russians want to build a gas pipeline down through North Korea connecting South Korea. So they are all for stability and economic development. And I think the Chinese do not like at all the idea of North Korea moving toward a full-blown nuclear weapons status because of what that would do to Japan. And given China's hostility to Japan vis-a-vis the Paracels and unresolved historical issues, the last thing they want to see is Japan having an excuse to develop nuclear weapons on its own. So I think we have a chance of working constructively with the Chinese and with South Korea to start the kind of dialogue that can possibly, hopefully, wean North Korea from this determination to become more and more of a nuclear power.
Secretary of State John Kerry made a lot of Chinese people happy when he sort of alluded the other day that he was going to perhaps move away from this pivot to Asia. What is their role in all of this, and how are they going to sort of help the process along? They play a major role.
I think that our relationship with China is one of the greatest unresolved issues that Obama faces. I think Hillary Clinton was a very fine Secretary of State, but she got a very mixed reaction to this repivot. The Chinese sort of see it as containment on our part, and we don't mean it that way. But there's a lot of sorting out for us to do with the Chinese. And I think we will be able to find with them, if we say, look, we don't want North Korea to become a full-blown nuclear power, and we don't think you do either. We would like to work with you to establish a new pattern of relations with the North Koreans, which could pivot them toward economic development, toward greater economic stability, and away from nuclear weapons. And we could also say we have no intention of moving troops any farther north than they are, and we're not at all interested in sort of ending Korea's role as a buffer state. We know that you like weak states on your border, but the weak state on your border is now very unstable, and let's work for a bit more stability.
China wants stability.
Absolutely.
Essentially what they want.
Absolutely.
President Park Geun-hye will be meeting with U.S. President Barack Obama. We have to assume in the coming months here. What should be at the top of their agenda? You're sitting in that room. What would you like the one takeaway to be from that meeting between the two leaders?
I think it's terribly important for them to relate well as human beings, and I am very confident that they will. Having seen her in action, having watched Obama to see who he reacts well to, he has huge respect for South Korea already, even in the face of the fact that he built that respect when Lee Myung-bak, who was less than my favorite president of South Korea, and with Lee Myung-bak gone and Park Geun-hye in place, I think that relationship is going to get stronger. And then I think there can, once that rapport is established, which I think is going to come very quickly, they can say, look, neither of us want any more tensions on the Korean Peninsula. What can we do jointly to reach out to North Korea in a way that can start the sustained dialogue that we both feel is in our interest?
Ambassador Gregg, we thank you very much for being here today and providing your insights for us here on After 10.
I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
And thank you, as always, for watching. We'll see you next week, After 10.